Tim. Welcome to Watch One, and thanks for logging on. Well, we survived the weekend for once, and we're back. Now, Monday is usually mailbag, but today I'm joined by my friend, Dr. John Gentile. John, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Now, he's here, just as our friend Bill Barner was, to share his memories, his collection, and his opinions on watch collecting in general. So this is still Monday Mailbag, and it is your show, but you're going to have to share today because I've got a good friend. And I can tell you he's a good friend because he has impeccable taste. We met at a JLC boutique event 2 years ago.
Correct.
So John, let's kind of walk out into the display area. You have many watches. So logically, let's start at the beginning. What is your first wristwatch memory? I mean, not just as a collector, but period.
The first memory I had was my father's Wittenauer, and it was a 1950 Wittenauer, and I was very excited to see it, and I really wanted, I couldn't wait till I received it from my father. Very small, rectangular. Of course, you know, Wittenauer long jeans were the same brand, and he finally gave it to me before he passed away, I believe in the 90s. And I wore it for a while, but that was my first introduction to what I thought was a good watch at the time.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because you were talking to me a little bit about this before, and you said it was 14 karat gold.
Right, it was 14 karat gold on the back, 14K, and he paid for it in 1947, $35.
You're not going to, I've got my Swatch Blue Rebel down here, it costs twice that. But I mean, 14 karat gold, that used to be the standard. That was a big deal in the United States. We didn't have 18 karat.
No.
We certainly didn't have any higher grade than that. So in the US, you're either going to get gold filled, you're going to get 7 karat, or you're going to get 14, and that was the top of the heap.
It was 14 karat, and he gave it to me, and I remember my mother saying, you know, we got this for your dad in he bought it in New York, they lived in Brooklyn, and they got it from someone that they knew and paid $35, stamped on the back 14K.
Very cool stuff. Now, I remember my personal first memory of a watch, and I was just saying this, it wasn't really of a watch at all. It was during the 80s, my dad had this red quartz LED display thing. I'm sure it was some horrendous, like, I'm sure it cost $35 in the 80s. But it had this extensible bracelet that stretched, and it blew my 4-year-old mind, and I guess from then on I was hooked. So, now, there's a big step, I guess, from inheriting a watch, which is a common experience in the collector community. But at some point, you crossed over from just having inherited timepieces to actually being a collector yourself. And when did you cross that threshold?
1977. Prior to that, I was just wearing Timex's watches that didn't mean much. And the watch you're holding now was my first watch, 1977. I had been in practice at that time about 5 years, and people said, oh, you need to get a Rolex. So I came across, it was actually a jeweler, and I bought this. This is a Datejust Thunderbird or Turnograph. And I replaced the dial, which about 5 years later in the early 80s. It's still my go-to watch. It's very durable, and it's on the, of course, the Jubilee bracelet.
Now, what's interesting about this watch is that it's a now extinct thread of Rolex DNA, but right up until 2010, Rolex sold a model that was called the Datejust Turnograph, and it had a rotating bezel, and it goes back to 1953. People always say, oh, Submariner, Submariner, Submariner. No, it was actually the predecessor of this watch that was the first rotating bezel Rolex.
Right.
And this one's interesting because you can see, not only is it a Turnograph style bezel, bidirectional, but it's got a little bit of the bark aesthetic that was popular in the late 70s, early 1980s. This is, in my opinion, the kind of watch that if the Ebel 1911 chronograph weren't like iconic of Miami Vice, I would say this watch would be in hot pursuit.
And they make them today, but this bezel particularly is very deep cut. The numbers are very deep cut. The ones today are very shallow, so that's how you know it's an older model. Turnograph, Thunderbird. It was also called the pilot's watch because obviously, but it's really called the Datejust Thunderbird or Turnograph. Yeah,
and it does have a direct genetic link to that watch that's called the Thunderbird because for a period during the 1950s, that model was issued, service issue, to the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds, which are kind of like our Air Force version of the Blue Angels. So that's where you entered the world of high-end watch ownership, and it's been a long journey from there, and you've actually reached back in time. You've actually got a gorgeous Breitling chronomat. This is the reference 769, folks, and this is the definition of awesome because John has it with the original factory owner's manual for the watch.
So that watch was given to me by a colleague of mine, who he got it from a colleague of his at school was given to a Swiss student who attended chiropractic college in 1950. The watch is from, I believe, 1950 or 52. And the interesting thing is the booklet, by the way, will tell you everything, how to convert dollars to francs. If you're flying, it gives you examples, and you have this much left in your tank. Yeah. It has 3 registers, the outer, the middle, and the inner. And it's, as Tim will testify, the chronograph still works on it.
Yeah, not only does the chronograph still work, but this one's set up for long distance bills circa right about 1950. You can see the minutes register with the red hand close to the crown actually has those 3-minute slashes denoting the billing periods of long distance calls. 3 minutes, 6 minutes, 9 minutes. A lot of people don't realize the Navitimer was not first in the Breitling catalog with the calculator bezel. It was more advanced,
yes,
but the first was actually the 1942 Chronomat, and you know, kind of started the flame that never died. This one's impressive because it actually has the Swiss, I'm not sure if we can see this, Faylene, but it actually has the Swiss brevet or patent number printed just below the junction of the hands on the dial. You can see the Swiss cross and the patent number right there.
Yeah, it's 20, I can't see it, they can see the 27012 right under there.
That's the great thing, though.
Right.
You know, 60 plus years later, you can still read it off the dial. This one's beautifully untouched.
It has the light crystal, by the way.
And by the way, guys, I got to show you that in some sort of macro, because the distortion you get off a crystal like this is exactly what people are talking about when they talk about the charm of a plexiglass. This is why you wouldn't just want a sapphire on everything, because of that distortion and that vintage bubble aesthetic.
And the beauty to me is it's an original dial. It's pitted, it's worn, it's just got, you know, it's got so much history to it that I love it. It's just original. It's great.
That's an absolute fact, and it's kind of interesting because I was looking through auctions that are passing us and coming up, and one that really caught my eye, and Faylene has some graphics to accompany this. There's a Watches of Knightsbridge auction on March 18th, and they have some interesting vintage JLC. And lot 137 is kind of from this mid-century era we're talking about. It's a Memovox, it's a bumper automatic, it's a black dial, and it's got a really nice straight steel case. And when this one pops up on the screen, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. But there's also this understanding among the JLC being offered in this auction that it's better to have a dial like yours that's got a little bit of wear and tear on it, but it's better to keep it factory and keep it in a state of sort of arrested decay than to just renew it.
That arrested decay. People say to me, John, you know, you got to get that dial fixed. I say, no, you don't want that dial fixed. You want to leave it like that.
Exactly. I've heard too many stories where someone like proudly told me how he had his tritium dial Panerai swapped out for Luminova, and he talks about how service set him up and his guy got him good, and I'm like, oh please.
You got him good, all right.
I can't finish I can't finish the thought. But one of the more interesting watches after that nice 60s Memovox, which is kind of like the definitive 60s alarm watch in my view, is this interesting JLC lot 129, which has a salmon dial that's actually a speckled patina. It's almost like you've got little bits of almost oxidized plot, almost like speckled across like sprinkles, but like you said, it's factory once. Better to keep it that way.
That's always that way. Always original dials.
So now, let me just hear your thoughts in general on the auction scene, because I think this Watches of Knightsbridge company is interesting because they're off the beaten path. They're not Phillips, they're not, you know, Corum, they're not Christie's, they're not Sotheby's, and in general, the watches like these JLCs, they're estimating them like between $2,000 and $5,000. Has it gotten out of hand on the high end of the market?
Well, I think it has to a degree, but I tell people when they say, well, what about the auction market? And I've looked at Christie's and Sotheby's. There's another company called Jones and Horan, which you've probably heard of, which does more vintage. You just have to make sure that they're going to guarantee what they sell to you. You have to make sure that when you get that watch, it's checked out. You know, I get nervous about buying watches online at auctions. To me, it's like buying a car. I'm not so sure I would do that, but it's the same thing. Is it going to be original? You have to trust, as they always say, trust the seller. That's what you want to see. Or in this case, trust the auction house. You just have to be careful, and I always say make sure when you do get it, they give you a grace period of 3 to 5 days. You can get the watch checked out, and you can return it, and they'll take it back. Has to happen that way.
And now there's some other interesting watches in this auction. I saw they had a JLC Shark, which is the reference 2643, but I think that one's been unfortunately priced out of proportion to reason. I think there's a lot of historical hype surrounding, unfortunately, Rolex, Patek on the vintage side, but also increasingly vintage Omega. We're seeing those escalate. Universal Geneva's already there.
Yes.
TAG, well, I'm not going to call them TAG Heuer, but Heuer also, I think it's been hyped to death. I think vintage Breitling, as you collect, still offers a lot of upside because people don't realize A, how rare they are, and B, how beautiful they are.
Exactly right, exactly right. I mean, they're rare, they're beautiful, and if you can get them where they're functional, we can talk about this one in a minute, I think they're great.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Pre-1978, before Ernst Snyder bought the company, they were very much like what those other brands I mentioned were. Not so much Patek, but in terms of that middle-of-the-market utilitarian sports watch, in terms of the elegant dress chronograph, they offered all of that, and they had distinctive character in their sports watches like the 1004, in their pilot's watches like the reference 806 Navitimer. So Breitling, for me, is perhaps like the last unconquered peak among mainstream watchmakers in the vintage space. So,
and this Breitling, which you had pointed out, was the one that the pilots wore.
Yeah.
They would actually use that when they flew to measure gas mileage left. They would use that. I mean, it comes with a complete book on how to use it. It was great. It wasn't just a dress watch, it was a wearable day-to-day watch.
Now, I like to say these days with the circular bezel Navitimers and chronomats, you can actually outpace your friends with their phones trying to calculate the tip at a restaurant. But this was a no-joke instrument. I mean, back then you can see the beaded bezel, which is characteristic of roughly the pre-1962, 1961 calculator bezel Breitlings. It's gorgeous, and even if you never used it to calculate a tip, you know, your fuel consumption or your speed over land, it looks fantastic on the wrist, still a great value. I happen to love these watches, and honestly, get them while you can, vintage Breitling. Now, I do want to talk about the other watches you have here, because you have a couple of brands that were just emerging in the early 2000s. We talked about the sale of Breitling to the Snyder family, but another Snyder, Rolf, purchased Ulysse Nardin during the 1980s, and he really helped to resurrect the brand by transposing the old marine chronometer style into a wristwatch format. So could you talk a little bit about this chronograph you have?
So that's a marine chronograph that I got about 10 years ago. It's got screw down crowns for the subdials, and it's got a screw down crown for the regular crown. On the back, by the way, it's got a titanium back, very interesting, titanium and stainless steel case, and it's got listed all of the awards it's won since it was founded back, I believe, in the 1700s. I wouldn't get it wet, but certainly it's meant to do that because it's got screw-down crowns. You can get it wet. I believe it's a 20.
My theory is it's a 2894 in there.
2894, right. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, it's a gorgeous piece. Ulysse Nardin, a little bit newer than that. First half of the 18th century, or 19th century, I should say. So a little bit newer than the 1700s, but the key thing here is that Ulysse Nardin really prototyped its modern look with watches like this. The 1996 Marine, which was a 150th anniversary piece, kind of coined a different sports watch look than you get from Rolex and Breitling and Omega, which are all sort of copying each other in circular fashion. Ulysse Nardin said, we're going to take the look of a deck clock, which defined us during our heyday, and we're going to transpose it to the wrist. And with that, they wound up with these marine chronometer wristwatches, these marine chronographs, and later on the marine divers. And they just did something that no one else could do because no one else had that heritage.
And that's a smaller watch, which fits. I have a 6.5-inch wrist, so it's perfect for me. And when I bought that watch, I bought it from an individual person, collector, who just wanted to get rid of it. He needed to sell it. And it came with, you'll appreciate this, he bought it, I think, in South America. It came with the timing certificate of the watch. So I actually have the timing certificate of when the watch was bought.
Now, this is a great watch to me because it represents a great way you can get into a watch with a no-joke movement from a major manufacturer with a style that's unlike anything else in a size. And this combination of steel and black dial, by the way, to me, that's pretty close to the perfect watch because it's also a size that wears well with a bathing suit or a business suit. Now, I want to give a shout out to our live audience. Also, I want to let you know, got a major event coming tomorrow. We're going to be introducing our newest teammate, Federico, who's actually sitting just behind this camera. So I've got my live studio audience and a rather elite one tonight for me and John right here. Tomorrow we're going to have a special announcement and a buddy show, so look forward to that. Now tonight we have questions coming in. So we have questions along the lines of, is that Breitling solid gold? No, this example right here is not.
That is not. That's gold plated and I think a stainless back. Correct. However, I do have one that is, which we can talk about in a minute. This one is stainless back, gold plated. This one right here is 18 karat gold. This was actually another great story. That was my father-in-law's watch, that he did not wear watches. And when they moved back to Miami, my mother-in-law found it in the bottom of a drawer and said, is this anything? Is this good? Do you like this watch? I'm like, are you kidding me? The dial was off, the crystal was off and the back was off. Now the back was very thin because when it was made in Switzerland in the late 40s, they used very little gold after World War II. So I had to have the case rebuilt by a case maker. Then I had to have the watch serviced. The watch was serviced by someone up in Pennsylvania who services vintage Breitlings because you can't get the parts for him. He makes his own parts.
I'm actually going to show the traditional slow draw of an 18,000 vibration per hour movement. This is an exceptional watch on so many levels. And again, John found this one. Let me try to get the best angle versus our light. It's not doing me any favors here. But John found this watch with the dial exposed, and yet you will not find a more interesting or intact vintage dial. It has a telemeter scale in red. It has a tachymeter scale in blue. It has a seconds track for the chronograph seconds hand, inboard of that in black. And even the grain of the dial, the original metallic grain, is immaculate. It's by a miracle that this one survived in a drawer, wherever it was.
It was one of those finds that you hear people saying, oh, my great-grandmother. This was from my mother-in-law, so yes. And it got Breguet hands. It's just a beautiful, beautiful watch.
I mean, it's an absolute miracle of survival, and it's a testament to the power of benign neglect. Every once in a while, we get very lucky. So now we have some comments and questions coming in. This is thoughts on Habring. This is from Sam. My thoughts on Habring, great. About as low a price as you can find and still have a first name basis with the name on the watch. I mean, this is independent horology. They're a little company out of Austria.
Yes.
And, you know, they have some pedigree because Richard Habring, the namesake, was a complications engineer for IWC in the early 90s. And from my perspective, there's something really special about being on a first-name basis with the guy who made your watch.
Yes.
And they're cool. I mean, what can you say? A few dozen watches a year at prices that are sub, pre-owned Rolex in some cases. I love the brand, and I think they have a lot of integrity.
Yes.
But speaking of small brands, now you've got a Clerk CXX here, a CXX Scuba.
Scuba, right, bad watch.
This is another small family brand. This one owned out of Geneva. Could you tell us about how you came into this watch?
I got this from another person who is an independent collector and had come across this, and I bought this from him. Cork is known for their 8-sided bezels. This is a rubber strap. It is quartz, which to me is a grab-and-go watch. You just put it on, go. Very durable watch, very comfortable in the summer, especially here in Miami. And a brand that a lot of people don't know. They think it's what kind of watch is that? It's so weird. It's kind of octagonal shape, but that's what they're known for, is Cork.
Yeah, and actually they're a very interesting company because, again, they are family-owned. They have an interesting and heterogeneous history, and this watch helped to set the tone for the later chronoscaphe and hydroscaphe, which have really come to define the brand. So you're kind of ahead of the curve, so to speak, in picking up one of their earlier watches, because it's not easy to find one of these in the U.S., an older CXX Scuba.
Screw down crown, screw down pushers with rubber around the pushers, so perfectly meant for someone to go in the water. It's water resistant.
Now that's the kind of watch that makes sense for almost any occasion where you need something that's tough, that's shock resistant, that's water resistant, that looks good and can pull double duty as an upscale timepiece.
Right.
And again, watches like this are a great case for why quartz needs to be understood as a spectrum between like my Swatch Blue Rebel and stuff like this. Which brings me to maybe my favorite watch among all those you have. Okay, let's say co-equally with that old 769 Chronomat. But could you tell us a little bit about this Rolex Cellini Jubilee dial?
So I got that let's see, I would say back in the early 2000s, and I was looking for a dress watch. I had the Bal Marcier, but I was looking for a dress watch. I was traveling a lot in those days. I needed a watch to go underneath my suit, underneath my long sleeve shirt. It's 18 karat, it's a quartz. It's got an ostrich band. It was bought secondhand. It was bought from someone who had received it because people owed him some things, and I got a very good deal on it. And it is my go-to dress watch. If ever I'm going to wear a black tie or if ever I'm going to put on a suit, that's the watch I wear, perfectly flat.
And what I love about it is that it is so relentlessly different from anything else Rolex made or makes. I mean, folks, let's count the reasons. Okay, first of all, let's start with a Jubilee dial on a non-Rolex Oyster. So we've got a dress watch with the repetitive, basically embossed Rolex Jubilee dial pattern, but it's also exceptionally thin. It's also a hinge lug.
Right.
It's a quartz. It's not pretending to be a sports watch in any way, shape, or form. How often do you see a hinge lug Rolex with a gorgeous stepped bezel too? To me, this watch is all about style, and it's uniquely Miami.
Right, it's just the perfect watch to wear when you're going out for dinner wearing a long sleeve shirt. You don't want to, you know, what bothers me is when I see guys with long sleeve shirts. Yours is perfect;
Yeah.
It goes under the cuff, and the watch is sticking out about 2 inches, and I'm thinking that just doesn't look good. You know, they're wearing these big Samaritans or these big watches. I like a flat watch for a dress watch that goes under the cuff. It looks very, very classic.
Yeah, that 6623 reference Rolex Cellini is never going to satisfy the Submariner or nothing crowd. But for those who are interested in the sheer scope of Rolex's history and the diversity of their past production, this is an awesome reference and a very different one. Again, if you want the Rolex that everyone else in the business park doesn't have, that's a great one to have.
That's the one. And many of those Cellinis are made actually mechanical. This is one of the few quartzes that were made. Correct.
So now we have a question coming in. This is from Bob, one of our live studio, viewers, I should say. He's not part of our audience, but he's part of our world of friends. Now, do you think there could be a bubble in vintage watches in certain price ranges? Yeah, I think there's a bubble. Let's count the bubbles that exist in the world right now. There's U.S. stocks, there's Chinese real estate, there's vintage watches, there's American muscle cars. There's a lot of bubbles right now that have been created by, let's be honest, relatively cheap money.
Exactly. And I think, again, when you're dealing with vintage, that is another whole area that you need to be careful of. Technically, vintage is anything that is 40 or 50 years old.
Yeah.
So that Rolex Datejust bought in '77 is a vintage watch.
Yeah, it's getting there. Yeah.
Yet, to me, a vintage watch is one of the Breitlings that's from 1950. That, to me, is a real vintage watch. But you have to separate it into different eras of time for me, for as far as vintage goes.
So yeah, I would say right now, this is what's forever. There was a crash in the Ferrari market in the late 80s. V12 Ferraris from the Enzo era took a beating. But here's the thing, they came back because blue chip is forever. You will always get your money back in the long run on a blue chip investment. The problem was the people who were buying up old TR4s, TR6s, people who were buying Jaguar Mark IIs, old Maseratis. I mean, the bottom line is those things took generations to regain their value after the crash. So right now, if you're able to buy blue chip Patek Philippe and Rolex, go for it. But if you necessarily think that during the next economic downturn, a Universal Genève, a Heuer is going to pay the bills, an old Omega, probably not. The bottom line is right now the vintage market, I think we can both agree, is overheated, and auctions are the reason.
They are. I actually happen to like the vintage Omegas, and that be one of the ones. I have another watch we'll talk about I'm looking for, but I love the vintage Omegas, the Constellations, the old Seamasters from the 50s, from the 40s and 50s. Smaller watches, maybe 32, 33, 34, but I think they look beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Right now, buy what you like, but don't overpay. If you're not comfortable keeping a watch long term, and you're not buying blue chips, I would say always just buy something you're comfortable keeping, because this is not a hobby to make money. I always like to say that you can create a small fortune in watches if you start with a big fortune. Right. So above all, just buy what you like.
But always buy what you like.
So question coming in, we have two gentlemen asking what we think of the Corum Bubble. Let me just say, the Corum Bubble was one of the truly original aesthetic concepts of the 2000s. So on that basis alone, I like it.
I like the bubble, and I'll tell you what I like more than that. But you know, you had the Corum Bubble with the devil, and then the roulette, the different, the roulette wheel. But I like better than that is the Corum Trapeze watch.
Yes.
I think that's a very interesting watch, okay, the way it's made. It just appeals to me, that.
Yeah, I mean, the trapeze actually even predates the bubble. The trapeze was 97, the bubble was 2000. What they both have in common is their role in Corum's continuing saga as an art house. We've got Rolls-Royce watches, we've got feather watches, we've got coin watches, we've got the trapeze, we've got the toboggan, we've got the bubble. And they're always going to be the company that makes the golden bridge. So aesthetically, Corum is a wonderful incubator for weirdness, and because the watches are well made, it's respectable. Like a bubble is built like a luxury product. Even if it seems silly, it's not built like a disposable watch.
And when it came out, it was fashionable. People loved it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's timeless. I mean, I think a Rolex is timeless. A Corum Bubble is not timeless, but it's interesting to say, you know, hey, look what I got.
Yeah, and I guess here's a great question. This is coming from our regular user, Eddie Landsberg. He's asking me, have I ever bought a watch knowing I would sell it in the future? I have to say, no, that's not a feeling I've ever had. I have a door that swings one way. I buy to own and keep, and I guess long deliberation and a roadmap philosophy of collecting is how I get there. So I think Faylene has fun little graphics here, but let me ask you, John, do you collect with a roadmap, knowing what you're going to bring in advance and then searching for it in disciplined, almost like Prussian soldier fashion, or are you more like Federico, flying by the seat of your pants and your heart?
Fed and I were speaking earlier, and I collect what my heart says. You'll see these watches here have different cases. I'm not a big movement guy like Tim is. I like different cases, different dials. Different straps. I'm a guy that likes different straps. I have alligator, I have ostrich, I have lizard, I have python. So, and again, I have to catch a small watch. So that's what I like. I'm not a guy that says I'm doing only chronographs, only pilots, only dot. No. I look at a watch and see if it syncs to me, and then I'll get it. And like Tim, I don't buy that I'm going to sell. I've sold watches I have that I decided I didn't like, but as a rule, I go in liking it, not going to sell it.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I once had JLC tell me that they just contracted to sell a watch that I have in my collection that they were trying to find. And when they told me the price that they'd contracted, I'm like, oh my God. But I didn't have to sell the watch. I didn't want to sell the watch. I wanted to own the watch. And above all, I wanted the watch more than I wanted the money. So, no, I never bought a watch with an intention to sell. And because I put so much mental energy into my collection ahead of time, by the time I have the watch, I almost already have a story to go along with it, and we all know that the stories behind our watches become our emotional links to them.
They do. They make it interesting.
Now, speaking of interesting, I would love to share the watch that you're wearing, but also the strap, because you're big on straps. I know a lot of folks, especially our Panerai collectors, have made replacement straps a lifestyle unto itself. But tell me a little bit, this is an automatic TAG Heuer Monaco, but tell me about that strap.
So the strap, when I first saw that, the strap is what appealed to me. That and the dial, which is the root beer or chocolate brown dial, and of course it's square. I didn't have a square watch. But that is a TAG Heuer Python band. It's not an aftermarket band. It came with the watch, and there's not many of those. And I loved it. I said, geez, how many am I going to find like that? I've not seen another one like that at all. I mean, they're probably out there, but I haven't seen it. I've seen Black Lizard, I've seen that, but I haven't seen a Python band.
You and I will have to go on a hunting trip to the Everglades. Trust me, we'll get you a new strap. We've got us some Python here.
We do. Yeah. Well, I'm doing my part to help the Everglades by getting the Python strap here.
That's why we're at the top of the food chain, right there. So we have some interesting questions and comments coming in from the live audience. This is from Corey Keeler. Tim, what are your thoughts on the best vintage dress watch for around the $500 price point? Honestly, I would say you have to just go, you have to be comfortable with anonymity. Because when you go with an anonymous, lost to history style Swiss brand, you can get a lot of watch for your money. I would say older Zodiac dress watches can still be had with Schild calibers from the 60s and 50s because it's not a brand that's widely acknowledged, and when it is, it's generally acknowledged as a sports watch purveyor. Now, we were talking about Zodiac before.
Right. You actually, and in that line, yes, I have a Zodiac that's not here. in that line, you can find a vintage Omega from the 40s and 50s
Yes.
for about $500 to $600. I wouldn't get it wet, but it's a nice dress watch, maybe 32, 34 millimeters across, but I think it's a nice watch.
Yeah, that's the thing. If you're willing to go with a brand that most people do not acknowledge, or at least in its class, most people aren't thinking old non-diver Zodiacs, or you're willing to go with small, you'll see that the options available to you expand. Now, always have the watches checked out, because when you start talking about obscure old mechanical watches, there's always the possibility that there's some Fourier caliber in there, like a Fourier 390, that no one remembers how to service, or you can't find parts. So make sure you buy something that's working. I will say this, if you have the postmodern panache to pull it off, consider something like a Zodiac Astrographic SST with the high beat shield caliber. You can still pull those down for a few hundred. And like I said, if you're that guy who's going to wear a polka dot tie, and we had one of them on the channel last week, that's a great choice. It's not a dress watch, but hey, it's the man that makes the watch and not the other way around.
And the other watch I keep an eye out for, a vintage Movado.
Yes.
I've seen some vintage Movados from the 40s and 50s, which are automatic, and they're quite nice, actually. Yep.
Also, remember this. $500 buys a lot of vintage pocket
Yes.
watch, so don't rule that out. Also, I would say, when you're talking about the $500 price point, if you're not looking for a Spaceview, real honest-to-God caliber 214, 218 Bulova Accutrons are still out there for that price. And you're looking at a watch from the mid-60s, early 70s that's historically significant, technically interesting, still contains an awful lot of traditional watchmaking. And again, if it's not the Spaceview dial, you're going to get a very reasonable price.
Yep.
It's still in the 500, 400, 600 range.
Kind of kitschy, aren't they? They kind
They
of
are.
that kitschy look from the 50s.
And
Neat. Yep.
they've got the watch that sings going for them. They're not silent, nor do they tick. They have a hum. It's in the, I want to say like the F sharp range. But, so let me ask you a question now. This one is from our friends across the pond and up
Yes.
north. I'm not going to delve into politics here, especially recent politics, but we have ourselves a Soviet Polzhat from the Soviet era. This is an actual Russian USSR era alarm watch.
Yeah, that was made in early 70s. It says at the bottom at 6, it says made in USSR. It's got two crowns. The upper crown is the crown for the alarm. It's got a crooked movement, and it does go off, and it does work, and it's not going to be that loud, but it does go off. That's the only non-Swiss watch that I have. And again, it just appealed to me. I said, gee, a watch made in USSR. Polzhat is no longer around. It was founded in 1950, and it was eventually bought out, I think, in the 70s. So it's actually kind of a vintage Polzhat.
So like many Soviet aircraft, cars, and watches, this basically took the best of what was available at the time and duplicated it. And it's interesting because with world time watches, with that evolving ring of cities, you can chart the changes in the world.
Right.
It's rare that you find a watch with a dial signature representing a defunct country. Doesn't happen too often.
A defunct country and a defunct brand, correct. Stainless steel back, Arabic numerals, kind of interesting.
Yes, exactly. And
Tesla-like crystal, you got to be careful with that crystal.
that's true. There are a whole lot of parts on there you're never going to be able to replace.
right.
That's part of the fun of buying vintage, folks. And again, that sub $500 dress watch, consider Polzhat.
And when I had it serviced, he said, whatever you do, don't get this watch wet. Don't put it in water. I said, absolutely not.
Yes, in Russia, we don't have that that year-round warm water port, and this watch is there to remind you. So, okay. So, guys, this is coming from Performance Car Spotter. He's saying, what advice would you give to someone who wants to start dealing in used luxury watches? Honestly, I feel like the blue sky to take off in that space disappeared like 10 years ago. Like, it's gone from being kind of a amateur business where one guy could create an empire on eBay to being, you know, basically a space where commercial grade enterprises move around. You can always buy and sell watches from your collection, but again, like I said, unless you have serious coin to go blue chip and nothing but, you have to accept that you're going to win some and you're going to lose some. It's probably not going to make you money. But many collectors, I mean, like yourselves, you occasionally sell a watch from your collection.
I've sold about 3 or 4, but I would no way try to do it as a business. I mean, you just can't compete.
Yeah.
Just can't compete. And you got to be extremely knowledgeable, and you got to make it full time. I've sold a few watches on eBay, and that's been about as far as I've gone.
It's like in the late 90s, we all thought we could sell used watches and day trade, and both proved to be a lot harder than we all thought. So the e-trade mentality has pretty much disappeared in the watch space. So that's my advice. Buy what you want to own and be comfortable holding it.
Exactly right.
Okay, want to give shout outs to our friends who joined us from the UK, from Macedonia, from Chicago, from Australia, from the Netherlands. Guys, welcome. Okay, so let me ask you a quick question about a watch that really intrigued me earlier, because it was kind of the dawn of a new era. This is a Daniel Jean Richard. If you know and love the Girard-Perregaux 8020 Ferrari chronographs, this is a great watch in that vein from the beginning of the revived Jean Richard brand. You know, it's an ETA 2894, but it's got a lot of character.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about the history of this watch with you.
So I bought that watch in the early, excuse me, 2000s, and at that time it was still Daniel Jean Richard. In 2004, it was rebranded as Jean Richard. The watch, if you turn on the back, was made for the Lancia Martini Racing Series, the Lancia car in 1983. But again, it was probably made in the early 2000s. I didn't know much about it, actually. Tim was helpful tonight to tell me about it. It's a number 63 out of how many I do not know, and Tim has told you about the movement. But I just thought it was an interesting watch when I saw it, and I like the fact that it was made for the racing series, kind of a car series guy. I thought that was interesting.
It's an interesting commemorative because I think you know the Lancia brand is not one that's too often acknowledged today. It's almost dead in Europe. So not only is it an interesting period piece, I mean, you can see that it's a modular automatic chronograph in the mold of the 8020 Girard-Perregaux, in the mold of the Speedmaster reduced, but it's got so much character with that combination of red, white, blue, and black on the dial.
Yes.
The subdued case satin finish, you know, means it doesn't have that bling gloss look to it, so it's very discreet, it's handsome, it's versatile, and it's got an interesting history with the Lancia link.
Right. It doesn't. It's not a date, so it's the kind of watch I wear when I'm not interested to know what date it is. And again, I like the way the chronographs are with the different dials.
And I'm not quite sure if you can see on the dial, but the dial is also signed Martini Racing just above the hour counter at 6 o'clock. And it's important to note for those of us who are also fans of sports car racing, Martini Racing, specifically Martini-sponsored Porsche, has a near and dear place in my heart. Especially those of us in South Florida, where we have the, you know, what they like to call the 36 hours of Florida, with the 24 hours of Daytona and the 12 hours of Sebring.
Right. It was made for the Martini, of course, was the Martini, and the Lancia was the car. So it was a combination of Lancia Martini. Correct.
So Lancia big in rallying, Martini Porsche big in 24-hour enduros here in the States. Okay, so want to give a quick shout out to a watch that I thought was interesting but haven't really mentioned yet because I've got one on our website. I don't like to have too much crossover between our collector discussions and a watch that, you know, that we're offering, but we do have one of these in our inventory right now. I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about this Speedmaster automatic date.
So that's the 351131, 40 millimeter Speedmaster, 7750 movement with the black subdials. A really tough watch, Speedmaster, and a perfect size for me at 40 millimeters. It's great. Again, I purchased that from another individual collector who was divesting himself of some watches. I really like it. Feels great. It's not real heavy and a good size.
And you know what I like about this, we all know the Speedy Reduced that started in the 80s and ran through the late 2000s. What's interesting about this one is that it's bigger at 40 to 38. It's got a chronometer grade movement in it, so it's got a level of refinement that's uncommon in these automatic Speedmasters from the early to mid 2000s, and it has the date, which you don't get on the Reduced.
Right.
So to me, this is a more substantial watch, but it's still got that fantastic tritone dial. You've got the Panda dial, you've got the red, you've got the silver, you've got the black. I mean, that's just a versatile and handsome and fun watch.
Yeah, very easy to see those subdials because of the contrast between the black subdials and the white dial. Very easy.
So let me ask you a question. Miguel G is asking us about Everest versus Rubber B straps. Let me just ask you about the idea of putting a modern Rolex that comes on a Rolex bracelet on a strap.
Great question, and one I have thought about, especially with my Datejust, which is an older one. I would only put if it was to be on a strap, I would prefer it to be an exotic. I would like to have either a lizard strap or a crocodile strap or a shark skin strap. That's what I would like to have. But to me, I still prefer Rolexes on Jubilee or Oyster bracelets.
Okay, I can see that definitely. Do you have any? Let's sort of segue into some of the popcorn questions I've got for you. We're going to talk about trends in the industry, but what would you like to see from Rolex this year at Basel World? This is a question that's coming to us from Crazy Stupid Gamers. That sounds like a clan.
I don't want them to go bigger than what they already are. That's number one. So it's a matter of what I don't want to see. I mean, I think they're now about 41, 42. I think that's
as big as
plenty.
they get. Yeah, I mean.
Right. I don't mind the ceramic bezel. Some guys get all upset about ceramic bezels. I don't mind that. But I think it's more, the thing that has been so great about Rolex is they're so consistent with what they do. You're going to know what you're going to get year in, year out, and they might go a little bigger. But I never see Rolex going 45, 46. I'm not in favor of that at all.
Okay, so basically hold the line on size. Ceramic bezels are okay. I've said that there are there's an interesting anniversary coming up, two actually. There's 50 years of the Sea Dweller, which could be interesting. For those of you who are old Comex fans, you realize that it really was 50 years ago that these things started to trickle out. And I could see Rolex maybe doing something interesting for 50 years. Also, it's 10 years since they revived the Milgauss. And it's kind of an under-the-radar watch for Rolex. So I would think perhaps there's something going on that front. If they really wanted to stir the pot and do something a little bit heretical, you can always go with a ceramic bezel Explorer 2, which would really change the look of the watch and maybe revitalize a line that's been kind of slow for them.
I like the Milgauss. I think the of course, again, how practical is it? Are you going to wear it in your MRI? I mean, I guess you could wear it in your MRI, but you know, you're not going to do it as a rule. What I don't care for in Rolex too much is the Air King. I've never been overly impressed with the Air King.
And it got really big and kind of weird last year with the Arabic numeral dial, the green hand, the Shaka yellow. Yeah, I guess I wouldn't expect Rolex to touch that one 12 months later, but it's an interesting opinion. Not everyone is into the 116-900, that new Air King.
I like the Milgauss. I think it's interesting with that second hand, but I was never a big Air King fan.
I'm going to say perhaps we see a Milgauss with a Saloxi hairspring. Possible. Okay, so also I want to ask you a question. If you could just keep one watch, any watch here or any watch in your collection, what would it be? This is a question we all have to hypothetically confront at some point.
I would keep the Rolex Datejust, and the reason why is it's the most durable of the watches. You can hit it, you can bang it, you can wear that with dressed up. It looks good. It's pretty tough. It's a good size, and it's a nice age. That would be if I could keep one, I would keep that. I love the Breitlings, but you just got to be very careful with these. Yeah. You can't hit these. You can't get them wet. They're tough. So either the Rolex or the Omega would be what I would keep. Yeah. I would favor the Rolex.
Rolex living up to its reputation as the one if you're going to have one. Okay, now let me ask you something. Last couple of years, a lot of new debuts. It seems like it's a geometrical increase in the number of watches that come out every year to the point where we see watches coming out every month, forget the trade shows. Of all that mass, what was the best new watch you've seen in like the last couple of years? What impressed you most?
Oh, I think the Lange. That is one of my favorite watches.
Zeitwerk.
The Zeitwerk, the Lange, or the Lange 1, with the offset time, the big date, and on the right-hand side, the power reserve. I just love that watch, and the Zeitwerk especially, because I've seen that with the flipping time, is just fabulous.
Yeah, the Zeitwerk is something truly special, and I think if we all took the pulse of Lange before the debut of the Zeitwerk, we would have said, you know, traditional to a fault, old world watchmaking, a pocket watch that you wear on your wrist. And then after the Zeitwerk, I think there was this attitude that Lange could do anything at any time. It really changed the character of the brand.
You know, and this is a brand that really was dormant during World War II.
I mean, yeah, after
and made
World
its comeback after that.
Yeah, I mean, bombed into oblivion during World War II and then collectivized under the Soviets shortly thereafter. You're absolutely right. This is a brand that was resurrected by the late Walter Lange and the late Gunter Blumlein. It's sad that we lost both of them, but what a legacy.
Yeah, and just, I mean, they just do great watches.
So now, favorite watch you don't own?
Back to the Lange.
Okay, there we go. Lange Zeitwerk. That was easy.
I mean, I've seen that and I've tried it on, and it's a heavy watch, but it's beautiful.
So we know what you like. What do you hate? Is there a type of watch you would never collect?
Oh, I would have to say that I've seen a dial, and you actually have had it on your show, and I think that was the one with the Pokemon dial.
Oh boy.
I mean, you've got to be kidding me.
You and I are of one mind.
I don't know if I would let you know, a 10-year-old kid wear that. And that was what, Romain Jerome had that? Is that it?
Yeah, they call themselves RJ Romain Jerome, which always bothers me. It's like the Dairy Queen $5 buck lunch. No, it's one or the other. It's either the $5 lunch or the $5 lunch. It's not the $5 buck lunch. And if they're RJ, then they're not Romain Jerome. Or they're Romain Jerome, but they're not RJ. It's like me calling myself, like, TL Tim Lane Mosso. Like, no.
That was an ugly watch. And the other ones are the watches that begin to get up around 48, 49, and for me it's like wearing a pie plate on my wrist, and my wife says to me, don't you think you should have that watch on a shelf? It's too big for your wrist. I've tried some on. So those are the ones that really bother me.
We agree. Romain Jerome, Pokemon, look, Romain Jerome, I love you guys. You do wacky things every once in a while. You do something cool. Please. Pokemon and watches, and never the twain shall meet. And in terms of really huge sizes, I mean, we both have fairly, like, I would say average or smallish wrists. I think the monster watch trend is over, but there's still some sizes out there that are overwhelming.
They are.
So I agree with you. I would like to see a return to classicism, at least in dress watches. So also, I think it's important to ask, as a collector, is there a modern style, brand, model, or trend that must end? This is where you can be brutal. Something that just must, I mean, okay, let's disqualify Pokemon. We've already established that Pokemon Go and watches are a no-go.
Well, I think, you know, from my perspective, and I've seen this, I've seen the Seiko, the Grand Seiko.
Yes.
And I like the Grand Seiko, but I think what they've done now with their new watch was at about $55,000.
Yeah, they did have an 8-day spring drive last year.
It's a big spring drive. I've seen it. I've been at their showroom that had it. To me, that doesn't make sense. In fact, when I was at the event that they had, someone said to me, "Yeah, but it's a Seiko." I think it just feels better in the $2,000 to $3,000 range. So I just don't like that $55,000 spring drive Seiko with the snowflake dial.
Now, I can see where you're coming from, because Seiko has, they have Seiko, they have Grand Seiko, and then they have Credor. And maybe Credor with, you know, a few dozen watches a year can accommodate that price point, but maybe Grand Seiko is kind of selling its soul a little bit, trying to drive that far up market that quickly to go from, like you said, the really good $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 watch into the deep 5 figures.
Right. It just didn't make sense to me. It still was a Seiko. I thought the dial was beautiful, but not $55,000 worth beautiful.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that is Grand Seiko stepping on the toes of Credor and confusing what is already a very young branding effort in the United States. If you haven't established your brand, don't confuse your clientele, not when you're building one, not when you're creating an image. And I feel like Grand Seiko in the US could be a great thing. I would say realistically though, as much as it helps to have a flagship, I feel like spreading awareness of Credor would do that without putting a $50,000 watch in the case.
I mean, I think that maybe they would have changed the name. I just think that when you look at it, you still think it's a Seiko.
It would be like if Rolex sold a $100,000 Daytona, and there's nothing artisanal, there's no gems, there's no reason to justify it.
Yes.
I mean, yeah.
The way I look at it is that when Lexus came out, it was part of Nissan, I believe, wasn't it?
Toyota. Nissan had Infiniti,
right.
but they were like hammer and tongs against each other.
But you didn't see a Toyota. They branded it totally different as a Lexus, so you didn't get confused about it.
And Lexus is Credor, and Grand Seiko is like your Grand Seiko is like your Toyota Avalon. Seiko is like your Scion, and then Lexus is your Credor. And if you could do something like the Lexus LFA, that's your 8-day spring drive. That's your $50,000 watch.
That's the way I relate it to, is when I look at it from a car's perspective from that.
And so I want to answer a quick question coming from our field, because we are talking Breitling tonight. But Tim, would you prefer to get a older 7753 based Navitimer or a modern 43mm BO1, and why? I would say, look, the heritage of Breitling is not necessarily born of in-house movements. They have a great chronograph heritage in the first third of the 20th century, but for the most part, Breitling was about building no-nonsense utilitarian watches, less a Rolex than a more heterogeneous Tudor. And for me, a 7750 and a Navitimer makes sense. It's in the line, it's in the tradition of the 806, of the big Navitimers. It's in the tradition of the watches that had the Venus 178s and the Valjoux 72s in the middle of the 20th century. It works. It's true to history, it's true to the brand, and frankly, A 7750 base movement is going to be tougher than a Breitling B01, and that's what the DNA of Breitling is, a tough utilitarian professional watch, and you get more of that with the Valjoux 7750 base, and you save some money.
And remember, Breitling was, I think, one of the original pilot watches. If we just go back to the watch that Tim showed earlier, it was a utilitarian watch that you could use when you were flying in the air to see how much fuel you had needed to go to the next stop. So it was a utilitarian watch.
And it was a watch that was defined as much by what people did with it as what it was. I think the B01 caliber tries to define Breitling in terms of what it is, whereas the 7750 is more deeply rooted in that heritage of a Breitling being defined as a Breitling does. So I'd go with the 7750 with no regrets.
Agree.
John, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been my pleasure to share the stage with you.
I had fun.
Guys, remember, if you like this channel, subscribe. You can also see us on Instagram. You can also see us on Facebook. And tomorrow, we're going to have a great meeting of the minds between myself and my newest best friend, Federico. So be sure to tune in at 4 p.m. U.S. Eastern. We're going to be on, and we are going to be on fire. John, thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
I'm Tim. He's John. She's Faylene. He's Federico. This is Watch You Want, and thanks for logging on.